Австралийн Welcome.
Сайн байцгаана уу хүн төлөвчтэй. Өнөөдөр ороо манай де факто нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор Австралийн Мельбурны Их Сургуулийн профессор Эндрю Уолтер оролцож байна.
Эндрю Уолтер Австралийн Мельбурны Их Сургуулийн харьяа, Нийгмийн болон Улстөрийн шинжлэх ухааны сургуулийн Олон Улсын Харилцааны профессор, Олон Улсын Улстөрийн Эдийн Засгийн онол, санхүүгийн хямралын улстөрийн үр дагавар, санхүүгийн зохицуулалт, Олон Улсын стандарт, дэлхийн эдийн засаг дахь Зүүн Азийн үүрэг оролцоо сэдвээр судалдаг. 1982 онд Баруун Австралийн Их Сургуулийн эдийн засгийн бакалавр зэрэгтэй төгссөн. 1983-аас 1988 онд Оксфордын Их Сургуульд мастер, докторийн зэрэг хамгаалсан. 1997-оос 2012 он хүртэл Лондоны Эдийн Засгийн Сургуульд ажилласан. 2012 оноос хойш Мельбурны Их Сургуульд багшилж байна.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Thank you for visiting Mongolia, and you have been speaking to Mongolians today.
Yes. Well, thank you. It's my pleasure. It's the first time I'm in Mongolia, so it's a real...
Please tell us about the event that brought you to Mongolia.
Well, I was invited by an agency that's part of the German aid effort in Mongolia, and they have a focus on development and sustainable development, and particularly in resource-related sectors. So they asked me to come and speak at this event this morning about the public management, or the effective public management of resources, which, as we discussed, is rather difficult in all countries, and Mongolia is facing many of the same challenges that countries from Australia to Sub-Saharan Africa are currently facing now.
Public management or governance, public governance in resource-rich countries, you were saying, not easy. In particular in Mongolia, it's even more difficult. What makes that difficult?
I wouldn't say it's intrinsically more difficult in Mongolia. I think it's a challenge even for very developed economies like Australia, with very deep capacities in governance by comparison with developing countries. So we face very similar challenges. It's a bit easier in Australia because we have that greater capacity within government and within the private sector as well. But Mongolia faces many of the same challenges that very, very resource-intensive economies right across the world face. So I think it's only more difficult for Mongolia in that Mongolia depends so much more than Australia on resources for its development, and secondly, it's at a much lower level of economic development and development of the capacity for governance and effective governance.
You have been sharing with us your study on resource-rich countries in the relations to GNI per capita. Please tell us about that.
Yes. Well, there's something called the resource curse, which I don't think is inescapable for resource-rich countries, but there is a general tendency for countries that have large amounts of natural resources to suffer problems of governance, and in some cases quite dramatic failures of development. So often what we see is a short-term boost for growth, but in the long term, countries which are very resource-rich often underperform in terms of income per capita and in other broader measures of human development.
What would be major reason of that short-term underdevelopment?
Well, I think it's
long-term. I mean,
yeah. I mean, it's very much a long-term phenomenon, and I think it's multiple in terms of its causes. Resources distort politics. They create incentives for private sector actors and public sector actors not to build effective institutions for governance. Secondly, I think the challenges of effective resource management for governments are particularly high. I think it's easier in some ways to govern a manufacturing-based economy such as that in Japan or South Korea, and more difficult to manage more resource-intensive economies like Australia and like Mongolia.
So you said resources mostly, mineral resource that, by the way, humans have not created. It was created by nature.
Yes.
And so it is the very claim on ownership would be very hard for a guy who discovered it, right?
Yeah.
So he discovered, not created.
That's right. This is very different to building riches out of pure ingenuity. Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, we don't have a problem, or most people don't have a problem in accepting that those people get personally very rich. But when it comes to resource-based riches, why should a West Australian citizen like Lang Hancock, who now has a daughter, Gina Hancock, who's extremely politically influential in Australia, the richest woman, why should she have more wealth than anyone else?
Which she was not created, okay. Yeah. You said that resources, the more resources comes, the more distorting politics. Why is that? Politicians.
You know, in Saudi Arabia, I think it costs about $2 to extract an average barrel of oil from Saudi Arabian reserves.
Okay.
You can sell that barrel of oil for well over $100 today.
Yes.
So the profitability, it's far more profitable to do that than to make an Apple iPod or a Mercedes-Benz. It takes far less ingenuity.
Tell us.
So the riches that these kinds of natural resources provide to the individuals who control them are extraordinary. These are supernormal profits, unusual economic activities.
Abnormal, higher than normal.
And so the incentives to control them and to capture most of the rents are very, very powerful indeed. And of course, this can have a very distorting effect, not just on the political process, but on the incentives to create institutions that help to sustain long-term and effective development.
So this is happening by nature of the people. You know, you have a super profit, which is, 50 times, or in Saudi Arabia case, 50 times. Almost the same with Mongolia, and in particular up from 2005, then after the crash 2009, we have a similar issue today, and we are standing like this, because then suddenly we were expecting all the time grows, and suddenly it doesn't grow anymore.
Yeah.
So that's exactly that phenomena you call, and many people call it resources curses. How do you find Mongolia? Is it in how deep are we in that?
Well, waist deep.
Okay.
Not over your head, not perhaps up to your neck.
Okay.
But waist deep in the problems of effective management of resources.
Yes.
Mongolia's done pretty well in terms of extracting, with the assistance, of course, of multinational corporations as well as state corporations and firms, to extract the resources from the ground that it's currently identified. So it's producing revenues relating to the resource sector that are way in excess, that are now in excess even of the average, say, in the Arabian Gulf. So it's really right up there in terms of countries that have successfully extracted resource rents. Where I think it's less successful, and this is where, it's waist deep, it's less successful because the challenges are so great in terms of the effective distribution and use of those revenues to generate long-term development.
You were mentioning about the resources rent, which is total revenue minus cost, compared to GDP.
Yes.
Depending on that, also you can see the level of how deep you are in.
Dependence, yes.
Yeah. Where is Mongolia about compared to other countries?
Well, I think the average for the Arabian Gulf is about 40%. Mongolia's average, 40% of gross domestic product. Mongolia's average over the last 6 or 7 years has been about 35%. But in the last 2 or 3 years, it's been well above 40%. So Mongolia is moving into territory in terms of resource dependence, which is similar to some parts of the Arabian Gulf, some of the very minerals-intensive economies in sub-Saharan Africa, so way beyond levels like Australia or Chile or Botswana.
See, we like to compare us with Chile, but still Chile's level is quite lower.
30%.
We are at the 40%.
Moving well above
Moving, yes. And that brings us really to this mood of being in Dutch disease and the resource cars coming here deeper, here slower maybe.
Yes.
And what is the very clear evidence of this curse?
Well, as I said, the curse is not inevitable, and it's not a fatal curse, and there are some countries that graduate effectively from the curse, and Norway, of course, is the exemplar, the great example of effective management. But of course, Norway had good governance before it discovered a lot of energy resources. Countries like Chile and Botswana in sub-Saharan Africa, the great success story of resource-based development in sub-Saharan Africa, are often seen as exemplars of the effective management and the achievement of sustainable and diversified economic development. So Chile has a much more diversified economy today than Mongolia's. So these economies face problems, but they've managed to overcome them. What we see in places like Mongolia is institutional underdevelopment. So the effective governance of resources requires quite high levels of administrative capacity, quite high levels of public scrutiny of the policy-making process, low levels of corruption, and many of these things, these are not unique to Mongolia, but many of the challenges that a large number of resource-based economies face are of this kind.
So you talked about the institutional development. How does Botswana, for example, make different? Chile, more or less, several of us visited Chile, and we'll talk about a little bit becoming familiar more with Chile. How about Botswana?
I wish I had visited Botswana, and I wish I knew more than I do about it, but it has a reputation for quite effective governance, for relatively low levels of corruption. I'll always remember when Japan was downgraded by credit ratings agencies during its financial crisis in the late 1990s, and its credit rating dropped below Botswana's. And of course this was shocking to Japanese public servants, and indeed to many Japanese. But Botswana is an effectively managed economy, as I say, with quite low levels of corruption and quite effective governance, and relatively equal distribution of the wealth. Of course, some inequalities, but far lower levels than in many other cases of failed development in sub-Saharan Africa.
Well, you have mentioned Japan once, drop it under Botswana in the list. We are now 97th or 94th out of 174 countries, and in 2012. But 2011 we were 100 something, which we made 20, so also 6 countries ahead.
On which index?
Corruption Perception Index.
Perception.
Which made politicians good sign, but not us, because still we are 196. We want them to go down and down, maybe to the 10th. Yeah. So you pointed out very important thing, that the resource curse can be avoided.
Yes.
If we have institutional capacity. Let's talk one by one on that. You have said that we need to increase our administrative capacity. What do you mean?
Well, as well as investing in physical infrastructure, Mongolia and other countries need to invest quite heavy in the development of state capacity. So most countries that suffer from the resource curse suffer from very weak, under-institutionalized governments that don't adequately provide sufficient scrutiny of the decisions that they make.
Here the difference is we have money now. We need to invest it, but the procedure is really a lack of, I think, the procedure, the way how we take out of full term of money, how much we have it is a different issue. So what you're saying is physical infrastructure development capacity of administration.
Yes.
How you would describe that process?
Well, I think you need, or every country needs a process of considered discussion, which includes involving civil society, involving the media, of course involving parliamentarians who are meant to represent the voice of the people and so on. So we need an adequate discussion of all of the public policy options on the table, and it's clear that in cases like Mongolia, with very pressing developmental problems and issues of poverty and inequality, undereducation, a mismatch of skills to economic needs, and all of healthcare problems, all of these challenges, it's very, very difficult to prioritize how the money should be spent.
So this is sort of a virtuous cycle. If you are not set up here, the other problems are coming. The other problems are coming, you cannot put it back. Yeah. Okay, so importance of the administration capacity. Probably it is not only the issue of amount of people working there, of public governance, probably the quality, the effective.
Absolutely. So it's the effectiveness.
And we have to pay more?
Not necessarily. You already pay quite a lot, I understand. Of course, much of that may be capital investment, which is very important, some of which may be directly connected to the building of infrastructure that's necessary for the development of the resource base. But clearly there may be also cases where governments are ineffective and inefficient and not perhaps sufficiently open to scrutiny of the decisions that they make.
And not to avoid that disease, you suggested the second issue was not enough public scrutiny, meaning probably not effective function of civic society, etc. Please tell us about that.
Yes. Well, many governments, of course, are increasingly engaging in public outreach, and ministers go and testify before parliamentary committees and so on. But of course, there's a difference between the appearance of openness and transparency and the effectiveness of the public consultation process. So there need to be long time periods when public policy options are considered before final decisions are reached, and members of society, including those potentially who are losers in this process. And one of the problems with resource development is that there are always losers. There are winners, but the losers need to be compensated, and they need to be built into the decision-making process to ensure that that they're happy with the process of development, and that they're being compensated effectively.
Two important things. You said there are winners and losers, and both, in particular losers, to be in that scrutiny process. Yeah. Why is that happening? I mean, is it something that really lack of because the resources or revenue, or it is lack of transparency, right? Scrutiny. Well, you call it the Westminster system, where the parliament members are cabinet members.
Yes.
In Mongolia, in particular, out of 76 parliament members, 17 are cabinet members. It's quite not easy to have effective monitoring on what they do, and you said also they're effective testing in front of
parliamentary committees.
What you would tell us on that? How can we avoid or change, or what is better?
It's true that so you have a relatively high proportion of ministers to so-called backbenchers, that is people without ministerial portfolios, and of course parliamentary systems become more effective when those backbenchers subject ministers to effective scrutiny. That requires a number of things. It requires competence and education. It also requires a degree of public interest and public service, that they understand that their job is to put ministers to the test and to challenge decisions they make and to challenge the procedures under which they make decisions. And so building capacity within Parliament may be one part of making decision-making more effective in Mongolia, but clearly perhaps also other... bless you. Yeah. Other parts of society need to be engaged in this process, perhaps to supplement for current weaknesses of the parliamentary process. So it may not be sufficient, but it's part of a necessary system of public scrutiny and increasing effectiveness.
You know, in a country like UK, it may work. But in a country like Mongolia, where we have such a high corruption index score, close to 100th number, after China and before Russia, our neighbors, it's very hard to get these guys who has two hats to keep him accountable.
Yes.
What would you advise particular things on that?
Well,
in terms of Parliament, maybe.
I mean, I don't want to come here to tell Mongolia what it should do, or its parliamentarians what they should do. What works in other countries is mechanisms like a clear register of private interests and recognising that there's a strong potential for conflict of interest, so that when parliamentary committees scrutinise the decisions of ministers, we need to know.
That's opening very interesting point for us. So far, Mongolian officials, parliamentarians, politicians, big positions, people, they declare their income. But what you are saying is now they also register their interests, meaning that, if I understand correct, for example, a person who wants to be minister in particular sector, the parliament member who has become minister in particular sector, he has, and he should not have any conflict of interest with his own businesses, because you see, many people have their own businesses in their own sector that he is in charge of. So how to, Thailand, many countries also similar, what is the best to do there?
Well, in the Westminster system that's based on the Parliament in London, the system would be, if you're a telecommunications minister, or for that matter a minerals and resources minister, you shouldn't have a telecommunications business.
Oh, really?
That ought to disqualify, in the UK or in Australia, that would disqualify you. And those interests would need to be put in a blind trust if they existed prior to the minister, the parliamentarian being
disqualify. Who will disqualify in that case? There's a clear register system is there. Then somebody registering with whom, and who will disqualify? The Parliament committee, or what do you think?
Well, it would be a prerequisite of being appointed as a minister in other systems that you, in effect, distanced yourself from those business interests. So that if you happen to own a telecommunications company, you would put those assets in a blind trust.
Blind trust means somebody
you would have no control,
no connection almost with that. You don't touch it, right?
Completely cut, so that you don't know how those assets are being managed or indeed reinvested.
You call it
a blind trust.
Blind trust.
This is very common in the United States as well. So US presidential candidates now have to put their assets, often they're wealthy, they have to put their assets into a blind trust. So that, because the potential, if you're president, for a conflict of interest, there's a whole range of legislation that the president will have to sign.
We are talking about the level of even a minister, not the president. So even lower level, still this big.
Of course.
And so that you don't have a minister's company competing with you in this sector.
I mean, a minister should not be making decisions in a sector where that minister has direct business.
Either or, right?
Yes, you can't have it both ways. And indeed, again, in the Westminster system, all parliamentarians ought to publicly disclose their assets, which includes shares in companies and so on.
This is a good drop in intellectual thinking of governance in this country. The third thing to avoid this disease, you said, lower level of corruption. Certainly, of course, we intuitively know that. And we know how does corruption destroy the normal competition. What you would tell more about that, please?
Well, it's very good that organisations like Transparency International and other NGOs in this area are working and publicising outcomes. Of course, there are problems with some of these indexes, but nevertheless, I think they do very important work, but it's not sufficient. National anti-corruption commissions are important. I understand Mongolia has one.
Yes.
But the effectiveness of many of these anti-corruption commissions depend very much on leadership from the top.
Our anti-corruption agency so far finds within their opposition party those people, unfortunately, and they don't go yet beyond or inside on political party. But that's a separate issue. I think it's a residual issue, compared with what we had before. This anti-corruption. With these proper agencies, including that anti-corruption, altogether we talk about institutional development, which requires capital to invest in physical and human resources, right?
So it requires money, it requires expertise, so it's crucial that there are good people with the appropriate skills in these kinds of agencies, whether we're talking about the Ministry of Resources or Ministry of Agriculture and Industry, Ministry of Finance, it's crucial. But they also need, and particularly in the enforcement agencies, sufficient independence to pursue problems when they see them. And this is classically the case in anti-corruption agencies, where there needs to be empowerment and they need the ability independently to prosecute cases and to pursue cases, and they need sufficient resources to do that.
So you are saying in several occasions about independent expertise being on board of supervisory organizations. And yet in this country, they nominate mostly own political people to this sort of board, across all boards of institutions. How can we stop it?
Well, it's a difficult problem, and there's a tension between the democratization process and the desire to have parliament engaged, and Mongolia is a parliamentary democracy, so the need to assert the sovereignty of Parliament and Parliament's right to scrutinise really important matters of public policy is correct. On the other hand, agencies, and particularly agencies setting policy, whether we're talking about infrastructure development and the prioritisation of infrastructure projects, whether we're talking about anti-corruption, whether we're talking about financial sector regulation, agencies like this need to be independently resourced, effectively resourced, and they need the capacity sometimes to pursue politically difficult subjects.
So it's a matter of paying them properly, it's a matter of having right expertise with right skills, right? And plus no intervention or less intervention by the political interests.
A general understanding that no one is above the law, that the law applies to all.
Well, that's something we say we understand, but not it goes to every person. Since you are a person, you spent 16 years in England at the London School of Economics, and now you're back to resource-rich country,
my home country, Australia,
home country, and doing that work for governance, right? Public governance school at the Melbourne University.
Yes.
I would like to ask two things. First, tell us about this famous London School of Economics and why you have been working and what you were doing there so long.
Well, I love London, and it was difficult to leave it, and difficult to leave such a good university. But Australia is, as it's very conscious, part of the Asian century. And I'd been at the London School of Economics for 16 years, mainly in the international relations department and helping to develop a global executive program there. 16 years is a long time, and I felt it was time for a change. And Australia is a resource-rich country with some of the problems of resource-curse countries, but also very exciting and a lot of opportunities. And my own research interests also are very much focused on Asia. So coming back to Australia helped me, and helps me to explore those interests more thoroughly. And being here in Mongolia is part of that. So it's a country I've never been to, and I've done research on East Asia in the past, developing East Asia, Japan and China. But I think Mongolia is a new frontier country for me.
Now, after your experience, what you do in Australia in terms of public governance training and education part, that is something we have to go through, and I hope there will be institutions who will be working with you in cooperation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the key ideas behind the Melbourne School of Government is to leverage the capacity that exists in the university to try to address some of these deep governance challenges, which both Australia and Mongolia face. From a very interdisciplinary perspective, but also from a very practical public policy perspective. And so we are very interested in issues like developing governance capacity in these sorts of countries, and specifically in the sorts of sectors we've been talking about. And so we have a lot of, and we're putting a lot of effort, both research and teaching effort, into building training as well as research that are directly relevant to some of the issues we've been talking about.
That's quite like doctor ordered in Mongolia issues.
Yes.
Second part on this education related matter, I was thinking about how to get education, universities connected, hooked up together with businesses. What kind of mechanism does it work? In Australia or in England, to best your knowledge, please. What you would advise to have this, missing link?
It's really important, and universities can play quite a fundamental role in helping to diversify resource-based economies like Australia or Mongolia, and to generate expertise that has real, positive economic development outcomes in terms of intellectual property. Australia's been quite successful, for example, in the healthcare sector, and so there's some interesting collaboration between private medical and public medical research and the university. I think in Melbourne we have one of the largest health complexes in the Southern Hemisphere.
Who owns that complex?
Well, it's sometimes university, sometimes public owned, sometimes private.
Yes,
so
that's the whole clear picture of who owns what, because in terms of efficiency. Obviously here we see more or less efficient private sector and completely less efficient state sector.
Right.
All of them run with losses almost 1/3.
Yes.
They keep increasing.
Yes.
That's the problem. And I think you will find also a lot of other things to study more, maybe to help. I think this sort of study will help Mongolia a lot to be more competitive, diversifying our economy. And overall, I think what you said at the meeting of UB Impulse to the university students, researchers, professors, I really echoing with what you are doing in Australia. So you go back, and how do you see when you will be back?
I'm going back on Sunday.
Back to Mongolia?
No, back to Australia on Sunday.
Okay.
Yeah, and I hope to come back to Mongolia at some point because I think there's some really interesting issues here, and the School of Government in Melbourne is really interested in extending its reach right throughout Asia and doing some collaborative work and helping with building capacity here.
I strongly believe that Mongolia has to learn a lot from Australia and Canada, because very pragmatic approach because you have tried, tested all this, and you have certain, and of course we're a smaller economy, but the principles, that's how we would like to learn more, and I hope with your experience and now with your knowledge about Mongolia, it will be another good step forward to that direction.
I hope so too.
Thank you very much for coming to this interview and sharing your knowledge.
Thank you very much.
You.
You're very welcome.